You can use dry fly hackle tips and so forth, but I really prefer the saddle. Pick out 2 of these of appropriate size so that they match up. And appropriate size just means that they're not huge and not small. In this case, it's a size 12 hook, so just that medium size. Take up one of the Grizzly hen saddle hackles, and then the other. They should be fairly well matched. Notice they have a curve to them. Set them so that the curves are going away from one another. For right-handers, get both wings, both hackle tips, in your left hand. Notice they're curving away. And then even them so they come out to the same point. In other words, so they're extending from your grip the same distance. Then they're ready to tie in as wings. Measure those so that they reach from the tips right at the eye of the hook to your tie-in point, which will be right at mid-bend. That is, halfway between where the bend starts and the bend ends, right in between there. You can see if I sight along the edge of my thumb, I'm looking at that point. That's a good way to measure points, by the way, is to use the way you hold the material as part of a way to note the measured point. But with this wing, one advantage is that it's barred, so it has the white and black stripes. You can use those as a gauge also. Hold that down right at so that that measured point is right where the thread is, right where the thread has stopped. Use the pinch and tie in your wings. Now, before you do anything else, keep that tension on the thread and take several tight turns, just as you always do when you tie in a material. Wrap back a little ways and trim off the butts. Trim them at an angle. Don't trim them straight across bluntly. This is a rule that you should keep in mind almost always when you're tying flies. Cut things at an angle. Then you will have a taper that's easy to wrap thread up and down. You won't have a blunt edge. If your foundation of your fly has a blunt edge or a dip or some problem like that, then the fly that you tie over it will still have that same problem, that same inconsistency. So if you cut things at an angle, you eliminate a lot of that. Let's wrap back to the bend now. You can tie tails in 2 different ways. You can tie them in up the shank and then wrap back over the materials, or you can tie them in right at the bend. I'm going to tie them in right at the bend this time, just to show you how it's done. This is the easiest way to measure also. Now the best hackles from a dry fly neck, of course you don't need to use a hackle neck for a dry fly. You can use saddle hackles, good quality saddle hackles. Either way is fine. But if you're using the neck and you want to tie in the tail materials, use these hackles that are on the sides of the neck. This is called spade hackles. They're kind of short, but they have long fibers. They're not good for much else, but they're very good for tailing. And you can leave that on the neck if you want, or you can pop it free. If you leave it on the neck, you can find the same feather and use it again for tails. Hold that feather in such a way that you can draw a few fibers off. Now I like to hold part of the feather between my thumb and first finger and the other part between the other 2 fingers. Draw the fibers rather, to a right angle to the stem, which squares the points, and then strip them off. Now just use a few of these and use the pinch to tie them in. Measure them against the hook. They want to be the full length of the hook. Now, take that measured full hook length and tie it in right at the bend using the pinch. Now you've got some Grizzly hackle fibers. You could have started with the brown, it doesn't matter. We will now take some brown hackle fibers from a brown spade hackle, strip those off, just need a few of them, and tie those in atop the Grizzly. Same length, you don't need to measure against the hook this time, you can just measure against the previous fibers. Tie that in, and now one more of the Grizzly, and that sort of gives you a mix of Grizzly and brown in the tail. Let's put in a few Grizzly fibers here. Now when you tie in materials, you have a choice. You can have the fibers gathered like this. Notice that they're fairly bunched together. That's because I used turns of thread over them that were only moderately tight. They're tied in with tight turns, but the turns that hold them in place back here on the bend are only moderately tight. Watch what happens as I tighten the thread. See how those fibers start to spread out? Now if I do that with hair, you'll be amazed how they'll spread out. You have a choice. I think for a fishing fly, you're probably better to have them spread out a bit. For a display fly, a fly tied just for viewing and mounting, I prefer to have a gathered tail. Let me show you how to use that dubbing whirl that I talked about earlier. And I'm going to take some of this muskrat, trim it off the hide. Now you can put it in a blender if you like, or you can hand blend it. If you want a really smooth body, then pull out these guard hairs. These are those long hairs, long stiff hairs that stick up above the fur. And then you have just the soft underfur. Or if you're not that worried about it, just cut it off and use it. Add a little bit of dubbing wax to your thread. And now I've wrapped the thread forward a little bit from where the tails are. And I am going to hook, well, the first thing I'm going to do is dub the thread. You could, of course, use the dubbing whirl, or you could use one of the dubbing tools. The dubbing whirl's kind of slick, though, and I'll show you how that works. I always get a kick out of using this thing. Now, hook that over your whatever dubbing tool you're using, the dubbing whirl, or again, it could be one of the other dubbing tools, and make a loop. Now wrap your thread back over that loop, just spiral it back to the bend, or even just short of the bend if you want. And then wrap your thread forward to just past the middle of the shank. Drape the dubbing loop over your finger, and then give it a spin. Should do it. When you let your finger off, you've got a very tightly wound bunch of dubbing there. Now you could have dubbed the body in the conventional manner, and that would have been just fine. But this is a good opportunity to take a look at how this tool is used. Now you wrap that forward. There are a lot of ways of doing this. You can keep the dubbing tool in the loop, or if you think that there's no problem about losing the spin of the thread, you can just take it out of the dubbing whirl. Or you could even put your hackle pliers on the end of this to keep them spinning around and losing all the spin that you put into it. And that's another way of creating a body. This creates a very tough dubbed body when you use the dubbing whirl. So it does have that advantage. Now again, wrap that right up to just past mid-shank, and then tie off the thread from the dubbing loop using your thread. Okay, it's time to set the wings. Bring the thread up to just behind the wings. Pull the wings, grab them by their center, and pull them back. Now you notice that a lot of little fibers are sticking forward. Reach in with your scissors and snip those out. And snip closely so you get them all. Get them in close. Now take your thumbnail. If you're a right-hander, it'll be your right thumbnail, and crease those wings upright. Now you see they're staying up. So pull them back, take a few tight turns of thread right up against their base to hold them upright so that they don't later start to lay down again. And then tug them into position and wrap your thread back to the front of the body. Now this time I'm going to use my base-mounted hackle gauge, and I'm going to gauge a size 12 brown, since it's a size 12 hook, and a size 12 grizzly. And I'll show you a few tricks about making the hackle collar, conventional hackle collar, that I think will improve the quality of your hackle collars, especially if you've never tied flies before. When you strip a hackle, one thing that will help you figure out where to strip the hackle is your hackle gauge. If you'll notice, the fibers start out very large on this one, about a size 8, and then they start dropping down suddenly until we're in the size 12 zone. Now they're going to stay in that zone, and that's called the sweet spot on a hackle, until almost the tip. That tells you where to strip the fibers. You see you have this section where the fibers are all the same length, and then suddenly they bell out, they get larger. That is usually, even in very good hackles, that is usually about the middle of the feather. And from that point down, you strip off the fibers. A lot of people go down as low as they can. They get down just to this very fuzz, and the problem is they have big long hackles and much smaller ones ahead of it. And in a dry fly, that is not such a good thing to have. So find that point, prepare the hackles by stripping the fibers from their base, and then tie them in. You can tie them in together using a light turn, and leave a little bit of extra stem sticking out there. That will help the hackles to wind well. Try to tie in the hackles so they're on their sides like this. Because you want them to wrap on their sides, if you start them out tied in on their sides, you'll find it's that much easier to get them wrapping that way. Wrap the thread forward over plenty of the stem. You don't want those to pop out. And then trim those stems off. Continue wrapping the thread forward. Try not to knock the wings out of position. Take a big spiral to avoid the wings until you get to about 1/16 of an inch behind the eye. Now, one thing with fly tying materials is that a lot of fly tiers are just too darn gentle with materials. This fly is going to be cast at up to 90 miles an hour. If you fish like I do, it'll be bounced off trees and limbs and yanked out of there. Bounced off rocks if you really fish like I do. And these materials have to be able to take that and the chewing of trout. So they're tough enough, believe me. You can be a little bit aggressive with materials. You want to be in control. You don't want the material to control you. So pull these wings forward. If you stroke them forward a little bit, they'll stay forward and out of your way. Take up one of the hackles, grab its tip in your hackle pliers. Now, get the tip so that it's in line like this with the jaws. This will keep you from bending the stem of the hackle and weakening it. Also, when you wrap, keep the pliers in line with the stem. And start wrapping that hackle forward. Sometimes you have to manipulate it around a little bit because I like the fibers to sweep back. That means that the shiny side of the hackle is forward and the dull side is back. Now here's the way I like to do it. I like to leave about 1 stem's width between turns of hackle. If I do that, then I have a place for the second hackle to drop into. If I don't do that, then the second hackle is going to send the first hackle all over the place, which I don't want. Pull those wings back out of the way, and now you can make those turns a little bit closer because your stem has gotten quite a bit thinner up here at this part of the hackle. And wrap right up to where the thread is hanging. Hold the hackle off the eye and take 2 turns of thread. That should hold that hackle in place. Get the wings forward and out of the way again, and now take up your second hackle. Now I'm going to try to work this so that it drops into that slot. Just work it around a little bit, and since there's a slot for it, I don't have to be all that exact as I wrap this. It's going to drop into that slot because the hackle stem is basically rounded, and it's not going to sit on top of the other hackle. If there's a slot, it's going to roll into it. And just keep wrapping it forward at about the same angle you wrap the first one, and it will drop into that slot, and you'll have a very neat hackle neck, hackle collar, not neck. Take 2 turns of thread. Now all that remains is to trim those tips. Trim carefully. And again, trim out any hackles that look like they're going to be in your way. Make the triangle as before. Build your thread head. Complete that thread head in the usual manner. And then tug your wings up into position. And if you want to separate them a bit, give them a little tug now to separate them. And that finishes the Adams, a very useful and versatile dry fly. Let's take a look at the steps we would have taken in order to tie a hair tail dry fly. Otherwise, it would be tied just exactly the same as the Adams, but I'll show you a little bit different in the hair tail and hair wing. First, usually on hair flies, dry flies, you want more hackle. You'll tie in 3 hackles. The other thing you'll do is when you wrap that first thread layer, you'll go probably back to the center of the shank, or maybe even a little further if you want that much hackle, because that first wrap is a guide as to how much of the shank will be covered with hackle. Wrap forward again to just short of the center of that first wrap, and now take your material, whether it's deer hair or bucktail or elk hair, snip some off of the hide, snip it close to the hide, and comb it out because there's going to be a fine fuzz in that. Just a conventional hair comb works fine. We're going to use the hair stacker, and you will see that there's no substitute for this. At least that's what I've seen. And just tap that. You can tap it against your wrist. If you want to drive your family crazy, you can do this. But I think this is better. Another way you can do it is to put some kind of material down, maybe a hide or something, and just tap on that. It doesn't take very many taps. I like the stackers that are wide because I can stack a little hair or a lot. And it's the ability of the hair to spread out that makes it stack properly. A slim stacker will not allow that very well. Tip this up a little bit, as I just did. Take off the cap. Now take the hair out, and you will notice that the tips are all evened. Try to handle the hair as little as possible once it's stacked. Try not to hand it from hand to hand any more than you have to. Measure it against the shank, tie it in same length as the Adams, using the pinch. And you notice that's all over the place, but don't worry, it'll get better. And then wrap back over the hair a little bit, really secure it in there. Trim the hair at an angle. Now, the best way to do this is just to keep hanging on to those hair butts as you go, like I did. If you let go of them, though, you can still just gather them up and cut them. Again, at an angle. Pull your hair forward out of your way, wrap over those butts and bind them, at least partially. And then wrap back to the bend, or just short of the bend if you'd rather. Cut, comb, and stack a smaller batch, about half as many hairs as the first batch. Pull out the short fibers and so forth. And when you comb the hair, you want to comb it from the tips out. Just hold it by its tips and comb. I like to lean the stacker just before I open it to the side. That gathers the hair together a bit. Handle stacked hair deliberately. Make your motions certain and don't hesitate. And again, handle the hair as little as possible. All this works to help maintain the stacked hair. Now measure that so it's a full hook's length. Tie it in using the pinch so that your measured point, even if your thread isn't at the bend, is at the bend. Make sure the measured point is at the bend. Tie in the hair. Wrap forward over the hair a little bit until you get up to where, just behind where the wings are tied in. Or you could have tied the hair in behind the wings. Just make sure the tails are the right length. Lift the butts up and cut them at an angle so that they overlap the angle of the butts of the wings. Now you've got the wing butts cut at an angle and the tail butts cut at an angle, and those angles are overlapping. This will give you a consistent underbody for your fly. Now, let me show you what I was talking about again about how tight your thread is. This is flaring hair versus grouping hair. Here are moderately tight turns. Look how tightly the tails are gathered. They're fairly close together, fairly grouped. If I pull that thread tight, they spread out. In fact, they spread out like crazy if I really pull it tight. So if your hair is fairly spongy, you want to use at least some gathering turns, just so it doesn't go crazy on you. Now let us say that we've dubbed the body, which we have not, but let us say it. And then pull all these hairs back for the wing. Push your thumbnail up there to set them up, and then take a few turns in front. So far it's like the Adams, but now here's the difference. Sight down the front of the shank. That way you can easily see where the center of the fibers are. You can divide it into two equal groups. Push your scissors down the center of the wing fibers and tug one half to one side and the other half to the other side. That separates the hairs into two separate wings. Now bring your thread, now I'm bringing it from the front to the back and then forward. It doesn't really matter how you do it. The point is you want to make some turns that go around the shank and between these two groups of hair. The idea is to separate those groups. With that done, you want to gather the hair now into the wings. That depends, of course, on how much your hair flares. But this hair flares quite a bit, so I'm going to take a few moderate tension turns up that wing. And that's going to gather it so that it is actually grouped into a wing. Now I'm going to bring the thread around behind the wing and down my side, the near side of the hook. I'm going to lift that wing into position as I pull back on the thread, pull it down and back towards the rear of the hook, and that will set the wing upright. Now you'll notice that we've reversed thread direction. It's now going over the hook towards me and away from the hook underneath. That's why we did the far wing first. Now watch when we do the near wing. A few moderately tight thread turns, but not too tight to gather the wing together. And then we bring that over behind the wing, tipping back, and over the far side of the hook. Now we lift that into position and pull back on that thread. Now we've got that wing set. Notice that we've also brought the thread back into its original direction, going away from us over the shank and towards us under. And we've got our hair wing and our hair tail completed. If we had dubbed the body, now we would add in 2 or maybe 3 hackles, and we would have a hair wing fly. The elk-hair caddis is one of those few dry flies, or flies in general, that could be called ingenious. It was created by Al Troth. Al found a simple way to wrap the hackle in reverse, which makes it a good fly for skating and skipping, which natural caddis do, and to reinforce that hackle with gold wire. It's a really clever fly, fairly simple to tie, unconventional, a good imitation of the caddis fly adult. We're using 3/0 thread this time, a heavier thread, because we want to really secure that elk hair wing. And by the way, 3/0 thread would also be a good choice for the hair tail and hair wings, upright wings that we did right after the Adams. Don't be afraid to use these heavier threads. If you have something that you need a heavy thread for, use it. It'll make your fly that much stronger. And you can also bear down on that heavy thread more because the thread is stronger and you can make your thread turns tighter. Now I just tied in some gold wire. I'm wrapping back over the wire to the bend. Put the wire in the material holder. Now we're going to dub quite a full body, right up to about 1/8 of an inch behind the eye. I've already prepared a hackle. You can go a half size larger or even a size larger for this fly than you normally would. Use a light turn, tie the hackle in on its side with the bulk of the hackle facing back and the hackle's stem facing forward. Lift the stem and trim it closely. Hackle pliers, now you're going to wrap that hackle back over the body in several ribs. The more ribs you make, the higher your fly will float. I'll take 1 or 2 turns right behind where the thread is hanging, right in front of the body, and then I will begin wrapping the hackle back. I'd use at least 5 turns of hackle on a elk-hair caddis. That is 5 ribbed turns that are traveling after the first 1 or 2. And when you get back to the bend, here's the way I like to do this. I like to hold the hackle tip and the hackle pliers up off the bend like this. Works very well for me. Some people simply drape the hackle pliers down the far side, but I find this is the easiest for me. You can do it either way. Take out the gold wire, take a turn of the gold wire over the hackle's tip. Now, this is the part that gets a little tricky, but it really is, in my opinion, the best way to do it. Squeeze the hackle pliers and release the hackle tip. Now maintain constant tension on that wire. Take a couple of turns and then spiral the wire up through the hackle. The wire is now holding the hackle's tip and it's also reinforcing the hackle, making it stronger yet. Some people substitute thread for the wire, but I still use the wire. When you get to the front of the hackle, hold the wire off the front of the fly, work a couple of turns of thread over it, and now grab that fly, pull the wire back and wrap back over it a little bit. Now the reason I'm doing that is just to make sure that wire is really secured, because it is slippery. Reach in with the insides of your scissors and trim the wire. Now you notice that when I did that, when I was handling the wire, I just grabbed onto the fly. Don't be afraid to grab onto the hook or even the fly as you tie. Especially these lighter wire dry fly hooks and long shank hooks tend to move around. They tend to be flexible, and they're hard to handle sometimes when you really need to put some pressure on them. So just grab the hook and support it as you see fit. Now go in and trim out that hackle tip. This pattern calls for bleached elk hair, which is rather whitish. Here's an alternative, is to get natural light elk hair. You can see that the tips are almost a cream color. And since I have this here and I've got some in my stacker, I've already combed this. I'll just finish stacking it. And I will use the natural light elk hair, which is, to me, just as good as the bleached elk hair. Now you want this wing, it's going to be a down wing, by the way. It's going to lay down rather than stick up like the Adams wing did. You want it to extend about 1/8 of an inch or so on a size 12 hook past the far edge of the bend. Now the conventional way to tie this in, I'll show you that first, is to hold it right there, make the pinch, take a whole lot of thread turns, lift the butts, and then take a few turns, tie off the thread with a couple of half hitches, and then snip these butts. I'll show you the way that I like to do it. I like to measure it. Now bring it up maybe 1/16 of an inch or so, and snip it straight across the eye, right off the tip of the eye. Now, drop that down, slide it back, so that that cut edge is just behind the eye. Now make the pinch, and you don't have to go back and trim the butts of the hair later. You can make that head, in fact, as small as you want, which actually depends on how close you can get the thread and make the pinch without going over those cut ends. But you can see here I've got a small little head. I don't have to mess around with it. And this fly will not have a thread head the way I tie it. It will have just a thread collar. Now, I'm going to show you another way to secure that collar. I'm not going to use the half hitch. I'm going to use the whip finish. Make a half hitch as usual, and now let your bobbin hang. Notice the two sides here. The side that's towards me, actually right now it's the side that is coming off of my second finger, is what I would call the working side. The side that's dropping down to create the X, I will call the passive side. Create the half hitch and then pull up on the working side. Notice that it locks the knot into place. Now, if you just keep working that forward and keep the bulk of the loop in front, you keep adding turns